A very good evening to everyone. I, Mrs. Surekha Prahlad, Ehsas Women of Bangalore, I am delighted to welcome you to all Kitaab, a Prabha Khaitan Foundation initiative presented by Shree Cement Limited in association with Penguin Random House and Taj West in Bengaluru. Before we initiate the book launch event, let me introduce you to the woman whose inspiration between all this you see here today. Late Dr. Prabha Khaitan was a trailblazer in her own right, born at a time when women were confined within designated roles of household works. Dr. Khaitan was a revolutionary character much ahead of her time. She was a philanthropist, author, poet, entrepreneur, and a campaigner for women's causes. A relentless champion for women's welfare, childcare issues, educational and cultural institutions, and promoter of Indian art and heritage. Dr. Khaitan had given shape to Prabha Khaitan Foundation, an organization dedicated to social and cultural welfare in 1980s. Her vision to work for a better tomorrow drives the machinery of the organization and is embodied in her famous words, "Karm hi jeevan hai," work is life. Almost 4 decades later, the foundation has gone from strength to strength and has launched several initiatives to further the causes that Dr. Khaitan had envisaged. We at the foundation promote Indian culture, art, literature, music, and highlight pertinent to social causes through all our endeavors. Prabha Khaitan Foundation's anthem portrays the true spirit of Indian philosophy, unity in diversity. Here the poetic genius, Dr. Rabindranath Tagore, flows into folk music of Rajasthan, Dadra fuses with Kajri. True to the spirit of foundation, we promote local artisans when it's time to show appreciations to our patrons and guests by endorsing their products. We encourage all to buy local products from local craftsmen in their sustainability and development. At Prabha Khaitan Foundation events, local food is served to soak the smell and flavor of the place. To create awareness in the community, we uphold one pressing social issue every month. We use artist Sudipta Kundu's poignant paintings to reach out to our audience and patrons on social media and through our invitations, and we try to create mindfulness amongst them. This endeavor is appropriately named as the cause of the month. This December, we are endorsing human rights. You may have seen the artwork of Sudipta Kundu poignantly depicting the same in our invite. Follow us on our social platform to know more about this. Among Prabha Khaitan Foundation's several initiatives, promoting literature is pivotal. We are always more than eager to celebrate the birth of a book, and we rightfully have named such celebration Kitaab. Through this platform, authors can display and showcase their newest literary works before a discerning audience and media through tastefully curated book launches. Today amongst us, we have Mr. Sugata Srinivasaraju. Sugata is bilingual journalist, author, and columnist, and has authored a comprehensive all-access biography of former Prime Minister Shri H.D. Deve Gowda, Furrows in a Field. This is the first biography on the politician in 20 years. The author has conducted multiple high-profile interviews, researched several public documents and letters, as well as several interviews and conversations with Shri Deve Gowda himself, where he has also shared letters and documents from his personal archives. I'm honored that Mr. H.D. Deve Gowda, the former Prime Minister of India, is present with us here to inaugurate the book. I welcome you, sir, to the Kitaab session of Bangalore. Now, with your permission, I would like the audience to watch a video which tries to encompass his contribution in Indian politics. But I'm sure no video can incorporate the colossal role that the former Prime Minister has had, both in local and national political area.
H.D. Deve Gowda, do swear in the name of God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of India as by law established, that I will uphold the sovereignty and integrity of India, that I will faithfully and conscientiously discharge my duties as Prime Minister for the Union, and that I will do right to all manner of people except as may be required for the due discharge of my duties as Prime Minister.
Now I would request Ms. Babita Katotia, SAS Women of Bangalore, to join me to facilitate Mr. Deve Gowda ji. May I now request Mr. Charanjeev Singh, former Ambassador of India to UNESCO, Mr. S.S. Meenakshisundaram, former Secretary to Government of India, Mr. B.L. Shankar, former Chairman, Karnataka Legislative Council, and the author, Mr. Sugata Srinivasaraju, to come on stage, please. Thank you, Babita. Now the book will be formally launched by Mr. M.N. Venkatachaliah, former Chief Justice of India.
I am privileged to release this beautiful book by Sri Sugata Srinivasaraju. Respected Honorable Sri Deve Gowda ji, esteemed Sri Youth Chiranjiv Singh, Meenakshisundaram, B.L. Shankar, author Sri Sugata Srinivasaraju, publishers Penguin Random House, and esteemed audience, and the publishers of the esteemed publication. I am deeply sensible of the honor of this invitation to launch Furrows in the Field, a biography of an eminent Indian and the pride of Karnataka, the former Prime Minister Sri Deve Gowda. The biographer Sri Srinivasaraju has earned the gratitude of the Karnatakas for placing on record the single-handed achievements of this rare and gifted man, whose passionate commitment to the cause of the humble farmers of this land has indeed been the companion of his soul. In a shining expression of gratitude, the Punjab farmers named one of their exotic paddy saints as Deve Gowda Paddy. Sri Deve Gowda is an obvious and preeminent choice for a biography. Sugata's impeccable credentials as a learned and discerning and a fiercely independent journalist adds a new dimension to the purpose of this inquiry, which comes after a quarter of a century of Deve Gowda's prime ministership. Every worthy biography has a message. To me, what Sugata desires to convey is relevant in the context of the traditions of democracy in India. Faith in democracy is really faith in its institutions. It is well known that when India declared its intention to adopt the republican model of parliamentary democracy with universal adult franchise, the Western world was cynical of its success. How can, they doubted, 300 million illiterate people successfully operate the sophisticated system of modern parliamentary democracy? The same Western press 60 years later said Indian democracy was robust, but the rowdiest. This is a tribute to the innate, uncommon wisdom of the common man. It was once said by an eminent political leader that he would rather trust to the foolishness of 300 million people than the wisdom of 5 judges. But that faith in the wisdom of the electorate is now waning. If one looks at the lamentable state in public life, it becomes evident that in a democracy, people do not get a better government than they deserve. We do not have any others to blame except ourselves for the hopeless mess we have created for ourselves, ourselves and in our public institutions. The underlying theme of this book that Sugata seeks to convey seems to my mind to be the need to look at the strengths and weaknesses of Indian democracy. It can even be held to ransom, and that even individuals can sabotage the democratic urge and spirit. The story of Indian democracy, its strengths and weaknesses, is illustrated through the political career of a humble farmer who rose to great heights by his brilliant comprehension of the controlling forces and their intelligent management. Deve Gowda's genial, friendly exterior conceals a strong, determined mind inside that by its own self-assurance can take on any challenge. The emergence of Deve Gowda as Prime Minister of the country and the unfortunate and unhappy way his tenure was cut short signify both the strength and weakness of our political system. Here was a man without any aristocratic political background or family inheritance or status who became Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy. But the way it was cut short is again the exasperation of Indian democracy that points to the perils of a fragile hope. The perils of a fragile hope. That short period tossed up a commendable record of efficient administration. Deve Gowda, as Prime Minister, chose some of the best bureaucrats in the Prime Minister's Secretariat. One of them, Sri Meenakshisundaram, is with us here. The late Sri Satish Chandra was another administrator of extraordinary talent and competence. The Delhi Metro is another shining example of Deve Gowda's vision of the future. Though agriculture and farmers' welfare were and are still his all-consuming passion. The impetus of the restoration and resurgence of democratic institutions in Jammu and Kashmir have the imprint of Deve Gowda and his commitment to democratic values. It is often said that cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. One of the political personalities of Kashmir politics, Mr. Saifuddin Soos, said something worth quoting. I want to tell you one thing, he said, which only I can tell you. This Prime Minister created a situation of hope in Jammu and Kashmir state. He went to Jammu and Kashmir 4 times. For 6 years, nobody went to Kashmir. You're all the time saying Jammu and Kashmir state is an integral part of India. Yes, it is. But why did the previous Prime Ministers not go there? Sri Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister for 5 years. Sri Chandrasekhar got a short stint and he could not go, nor could VP Singh go. But Sri Deve Gowda went to Jammu and Kashmir state 4 times, and he created a situation of hope and understanding there. This biography comes up at a time when the whole world is in a flux, not to mention the catastrophic pandemic. Strength of a nation to survive and prevail stems from the innate character of its people. The highest office in a republic is said to be that of the citizen. The prime duty of the state is to promote the intelligence of citizenship. Government is a potent teacher. It teaches by its own example. Irresponsible, indecorous, vituperatory and even vulgar political debate debases democratic sentiments and make people cynical. People lose trust in their government and their values. In science, it is said that intense interaction of nuclear energy creates a critical mass. Similarly, a negative social critical mass is generated by irresponsible and indecorous political behavior, which can create distrust in the democratic process. It generates cynicism, is the power of destruction. It takes away all the bright colors of national life and its constitutional symbols and institutions. Dr. Ambedkar cautioned against such violent agitational movements to achieve economic and political ends. Trust of the people in government is the most important single factor. The great Chinese philosopher Confucius told his disciple Che Kung that all the three essentials of government, food, military equipment, and faith of the people in the rulers, the faith of the people is the single most indispensable element. Studies show that in 1985, 73% of Americans trusted their federal government decisions most of the time. By 2019, the number fell to just 19%. Let us look at the figures as to people's view of the Supreme Court in the United States. Studies show that in 1985, 62% of the Americans held a favorable view of their Supreme Court. Fortunately, the figure remained the same in 2019. See the beautiful book, The Authority of the Court and the Perils of Politics, by a Supreme Court judge of the United States, Stephen Breyer. It's a Harvard University Press publication. That today's country's leaders need the wisdom to anticipate the enormous opportunities and challenges of the exploits of technology and prepare the next generation for them. The shrill, acrimonious political diatribe is not the answer to the imminent challenges. Sober, constructive, and creative early responses are the answer. India needs to create something like 30,000 new jobs every day. Half of the existing jobs are at the risk of imminent automation. Small traders and small farmers need protection. It is politically immoral to use them as potential vote bank. The existing economic structure enables only 10% of the people to benefit from it. The present deepening crisis is serious, but then it is said, crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Crisis is a terrible thing to waste. You could learn from them. This biography brings out the uncommon talents of this friendly, gentle, common man. He has, by his broad, eclectic culture and friendly disposition, transcended the divisive forces in society. Deve Gowda started his political career with his elected membership at the Haranachpur Taluk Board. The Prime Minister's chair was nowhere in his vision or reckoning. Sugata tells us the emotional story when, as Prime Minister-elect, Deve Gowda stood near the Prime Minister's chair and was overwhelmed by emotion. Sugata describes that emotional moment when he did stand near the chair 44 years after he had entered politics. He was overcome by emotion. When he entered the Prime Minister's parliamentary office for the first time and was led to his chair, he saw a tiny metal strip on it with Nehru's name. And the years he had governed India was mentioned. He froze for a few seconds. His eyes welled up. Even as officers began to wonder about his hesitation, he did a quick namaste and sat down. It was not the weight of history that he experienced at that moment, but strangely the overwhelming burden of the blessings. May Sri Deve Gowda live a long and happy life to serve the country and the people he loves so much. With this good wish, I launched this beautiful book. The publishers deserve our thankful congratulations. I thank you all for your patience.
Charanjeev Singh, Mr. Meenakshisundaram, Mr. B.L. Shankar, Mr. Srinivasaraju, and Mrs. Babita Kotodia and me to join in and inaugurate the book, please. Now, author Mr. Srinivasaraju and Mr. Charanjeev Singh will present a copy of the book to Mr. H.D. Deve Gowda. Can I now request Mr. Srinivasaraju, author of the book, to read out some extracts from his book, please?
Good evening, everybody. I am immensely grateful to all of you for having assembled here today. In the glossary of an ambivalent atheist, the word blessed hesitates to enter into routine parlance or conversation. But what I have witnessed in the recent weeks after the publication of the book is nothing common or ordinary. I have now no choice but to find recourse in the word blessed and reason with myself that the word has a greater halo of humanity than the omnipotence of divinity that the subject of my biography, Mr. H.D. Deve Gowda, has completely surrendered himself to. Mr. Deve Gowda is nearly a nonagenarian. He has read the book and has cryptically communicated to me that I have been fair to him, his work, his politics, and his times. I see in his response a graceful acceptance of the fact that no human, and certainly no prime minister, except perhaps the one we have now, can think they are perfect and divinely ordained. As I have said in the introduction of the book, he was most democratic while I wrote the book, never interfered in its process, and confined himself to being an archivist of his life. I consider my interaction with him a blessing. Another nonagenarian, Mr. Fali Sam Nariman, blessed me with all his heart at the Delhi launch of my book exactly a week ago. He studied the book for 2 weeks, spent enormous time making notes and consulting, of which I was fully in the know, and delivered a remarkable 25-minute address at the age of 92. Making a reference to Oscar Wilde's penchant for extravagant utterances, he said, that is Mr. Nariman said, every great man has his disciples, and it is Judas who always writes a biography. But Sugata is no Judas, but he is no flatterer either. Can anyone dispute the sumptuousness of that blessing for a biography that seeks balance and a biographer who seeks credibility? We are fortunate to have another nonagenarian today in Justice M.N. Venkatachaliah. He reminded me yesterday that he was only 92 and fit enough to reach out to his books, write his own speech, and pick his phone calls. His sagacious address today gently points out to the fragility of our democracy. It is meant to remind us of Mr. H.D. Deve Gowda's stellar democratic engagement over the last 7 decades. His was a blessing that I've always yearned for, and he has given it to me unreservedly ever since he launched another book of mine in 2009. I am deeply conscious and deeply grateful for the symphony of blessings from these 3 great men. And I will use the book title of another elder, Mr. Chiranjiv Singh, whose love, affection, and guidance I have greatly enjoyed, to take it further. Idu Yava Janmada Maitri. Blessings indeed proselytize you. They make you a believer in human goodness and generosity. The three elders here on the stage, Mr. Chiranjiv Singh, Dr. S.S. Meenakshisundaram, and Dr. B.L. Shankar's wholesome understanding of Mr. Deve Gowda's work and personality and their abiding commitment to his legacy has made this book possibly very rich. I will not say anything more about them, but allow you to discover Mr. Gowda through them as you progress with the book. My indebtedness to them cannot be captured by the inadequacies of my language. I will not waste much time, but read a small passage from the chapter Wrestling with Vajpayee and His Mask, just to create an atmosphere before we further discuss the book. So this is from the chapter of Wrestling with Vajpayee and His Mask. This is the 20th chapter. So I start reading from my book. The debate, engagement, and sometimes collaboration between H.D. Deve Gowda and Atal Bihari Vajpayee were arguably the unlikeliest of it all. The two would have never interacted as much if they had not been prime ministers and former prime ministers, and if one had not preceded and succeeded the other. Gowda succeeded Vajpayee immediately after his first 13-day brush with power, and there was the motion of confidence in which the two came face to face for the first time on the floor of the parliament. The frequency and intensity were never lost till Vajpayee lost power in 2004. Briefly, between 1999 and 2002, there was a hiatus when Gowda was out of parliament. Otherwise, for nearly 7 years, Gowda never missed an opportunity to engage Vajpayee. Gowda and Vajpayee were two very different people. Vajpayee was essentially a Hindi person. Gowda used English to communicate, which in reality was notches above Vajpayee's felicity. If Vajpayee was full of rhetoric, flourish, and pregnant silences, Gowda was always about dry details, documents, and a kind of drawl. When Vajpayee shifted his stances and positions, even on some of the most visible issues of the day, it was seldom noticed and never remembered. But Gowda's consistency was always put under the scanner. If Vajpayee invariably got the benefit of doubt, Gowda was always placed in doubt. Nothing stuck to Vajpayee, no allegation or diatribe, but everything stuck to Gowda, and many a times unfairly. Vajpayee was about grandstanding. Gowda was about trench fights. One was a Brahmin and another Shudra, and the perception about them, their refinements and commitment invariably had undercurrents of caste, traditions, geography, history, and plain old prejudice. When one reads Gowda's parliamentary speeches and interventions, it is quite revealing as to how many times, both as a sitting and former prime minister, and even earlier as an MP, he resorted to supplication through words like request, plead, and beg to be ordinarily heard during debates. He often reminded his colleagues that he was from a humble background and was not so highly learned. This, despite a reasonably good engineering diploma coupled with strong political and legislative experience of decades. His grasp of the law and its loopholes were legendary in Karnataka. Yet, Gowda never realized his importance, and he continued to beseech attention for his utterances. The weight of his vast experience and his learning, mostly self-taught, never added a dimension to his otherwise robust image of a refined political wrestler because there was nobody to package it for him. He perhaps did not even know that it could be packaged. He preferred to be in a groove of his own. He was cerebral in his own way. Vajpayee never had any of this problem ever. When he stood up to speak, people sat down to listen. There were many to add frills, flowers, and put on a pedestal what he had uttered and had not uttered. He was always presented as a representative of a great but suppressed philosophical current, of some glorious ideological value system that had been in chains, and of a gentleness and scholarship that had not received its due. Vajpayee even romanced the victimhood that constructed his political persona. When in the opposition benches, Vajpayee managed a guilt in people that despite being such a picture of perfection, was not on the treasury benches. When he finally moved to the treasury benches, the guilt was still kept alive. Gowda and Vajpayee's exchanges in parliament mostly concerned communalism, the farm economy, water disputes, the economy in general, and governance in the same order of importance. George Fernandes, a minister in Vajpayee's cabinet and a fellow Kannadiga, was also a cause of conflict between the two many a times. On all topics, Gowda spoke with his field reports, assessments of experts, legal inputs, data points, and enormous common sense. He made thorough use of the Parliament library, but never brandished his reading or blended it with panache into his arguments. But if somebody questioned him, he would surprise them with his breadth of understanding. In his first ever session and first ever speech in Parliament in July 1991, when the motion of thanks to the President's address was being discussed, Gowda started speaking on the Union government's plan to notify the interim order of the Kaveri Tribunal. Shankar Iyer, Mayiladuthurai MP, objected. Quote, "Sir, I am on a point of order. Is it in order for a member to devote, as he threatens to do, his entire speech to a subject which has not been mentioned in the President's address?" Unquote. Gowda responded, quote, "The President's address makes a mention about the development of irrigation. Though I am a new member to this House, I know that anything can be discussed during the debate on the presidential address. Within the ambit of rules framed by this very House, I know my limitations. Though I am a new entrant in this House, being a member in the state legislature for more than 20 years, actually close to 30 years in 1991, I know my limitations." What he meant was that he was experienced enough to know the rules. As Gowda continued, Iyer intervened again. Quote, "May I ask the honorable member a question? Does he or does he not accept the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court is the final authority on the law of the land?" Unquote. Gowda's instantaneous response put his memory, diligence, and the grasp of details on display. Quote, this is Mr. Gowda speaking. Quote, "I really want to compliment my friend. This is an Interstate Disputes Act." And he's speaking from memory, he's not reading out anything. "I really want to compliment my friend. This is an Interstate Disputes Act. A tribunal has been constituted under sections 3 and 4 of this act, which has been framed by this very same House, though I was not a member in those days. I am just a new entrant, and I would like to draw your attention to section 11 of the Interstate Disputes Act, which says, notwithstanding anything contained in any law, any other law, neither the Supreme Court nor any other court shall have or exercise jurisdiction in respect of any water dispute which is referred to a tribunal under this act." Unquote. Gowda was extremely sharp and well-informed as a parliamentarian and as a prime minister. He was never underprepared. His collection of books, too, was eclectic. He collected all kinds of reports on subjects of interest to him. He personally clipped articles from magazines and newspapers and placed them in files, which only he knew how to access at the most appropriate time. Knowledge meant one thing to Vajpayee. It could be both emotional and unproductive, like the poetry he wrote. But with Gowda, knowledge was about application. It had no other connotation other than information and data, something he could gainfully deploy either for the good of policy, effective action, or to fell his opponents. It could be said that knowledge for him was like soil. It had to be felt, had to be fertile, and finally give a good yield. The only abstraction he perhaps indulged in was his prayer books and the various editions and exegesis of the two Indian epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. But that too was not abstract for him. They were scaffolds around his soul. Thank you very much.
I would now request Mr. Charanjeev Singh to say a few words, please.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult for me to be dispassionate about the book because before Sugata started writing it, he had a detailed discussion, or I should say discussions with me about what sort of a book it would be. And my advice was, Sugata, concentrate on the person, on the man. The work is fine, yes, but the man should come through. And I'm glad that that has come through in this book. This is a biography which has set the standards for political biographies in India to come in future. My first memory of Gowda Sahab is as leader of opposition. I was Deputy Secretary to Mr. Devraj Ars and he was leader of the opposition. So it was my duty to sit in the assembly when Mr. Ars had to be there. And the first image I have of Gowda Sahab is, as leader of opposition, he stood up. I don't remember the subject, but he was so impassioned and angry that his face had become red, and he shouted, and this generation probably cannot imagine the strength with which he could speak in those years. He said, "Elli Nyaya." I think that can be the leitmotif of his life and this book also. His achievements in Kashmir, Nagaland, Bangladesh, irrigation, agriculture, etc. And agriculture, I think the finest compliment has been paid to him by the farmers of Punjab, about which Justice M. N. Venkatachaliah also mentioned, and which is there in the book. But to my mind, some of the most moving passages in the book are about his early years, his struggles, and as a person. I would just read one of the very moving passages. His father is unwell, and he goes to a temple and he says, "If I am my father's son, he should die in my lap." Later, I suffered from enormous guilt that I had used this phrase before God, which put a question mark on my mother's integrity. I got into a spiral on this indiscretion and suffered for a few days. The father breathed his last in his lap. This is the kind of moving thing which is there in the book at various places. Now, when Sugata was writing, each chapter he would email to me as it was written, and I would go through it and then give my comments and suggestions for whatever they were worth for. And I once told him during our discussions, I said, R.K. Narayan, who was a very dear friend of mine, and I was his evening walk companion for 6 years during my Mysore posting. He said, I I don't read Indian biographies, they are boring because there is no love life in them. Now, I told Sugata as the book was being written that Sugata, this is an unput-downable biography even if there is no love life in it. But even there I was mistaken when the book came out, because there is again a very moving passage. Mr. Gowda goes to Kashmir, looks at the beauty of Kashmir, and he thinks, I should have brought along my wife. Well, you see, this is what humanizes the biography. As I mentioned, in future, people will be talking about his achievements in Bangladesh, in Nagaland, in Kashmir, in the field of irrigation, agriculture, etc. But in a political biography, to maintain the balance between the personal and the official and political is a very difficult trick. And it's to Sugata's credit that he has been able to do this. What comes out in the book is not the politician alone. What comes out in the book is the man, Mr. H.D. Deve Gowda, who in Kashmir thinks of his wife, who, when the father is ill, wants the father to die in his lap. And when in despair, he comes out, because that reminds me of one of the lines in one of my favorite books, Anne of Green Gables, which says, to despair is to turn your back on God. He never turned his back on God, therefore he came out of despair always. And that's why there is this phrase that he would rise like, and he rose like a phoenix. Sugata has done ample justice to his subject, and as I mentioned in the beginning, he has set a standard for political biographies to come in future. Another thing which I found very thought-provoking, you see, since the beginning, since Plato's and Aristotle's times, there is this debate as to free will and predestination and destiny. Any thinking person after reading this biography would be mulling on this problem once again. What is free will and what is destiny? Mr. Gowda's great achievement is that he has been able to bridge the two. Those who wish to seek an answer to this question, whether it is free will or it is destiny, should read this book. I think that's another takeaway from this book which many people would remember in future. I mean, any thinking person would think about it, because that is why one of his astrologers said that he was a sthit prajna. This quality comes from this balance between what he believes is the destiny and what he believes is the karma. He's a karma yogi who doesn't believe in nishkam karma. And that's why he has succeeded. And the great merit of this biography is that it humanizes a politician, gives him his due, places him in the social and political context, brings out his achievements, and makes the book so interesting that you can read it like a novel. It is an epic journey which he has recorded. Sugata has done a marvelous thing. And penguins deserve a round of applause for bringing it out so well. The cover is also very well designed. The book is very well produced, and that's also an achievement. Sugata, all compliments to you for a very brilliant biography. He has outdone himself in this work. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Meenakshisundaram, to say a few words, please.
the dignitaries on the dais and in front of me. I really do not know what I should talk to this audience. It is very difficult to write a biography. I had worked under 3 prime ministers, and I wanted to write something about the comparative study of the 3 prime ministers. I have not been able to do it. For several years I attempt, but it is extremely difficult to write a person. And it is more difficult to write a biography of a person who is living and who has a background of some 60, 70 years. Sugata has done a very good job in looking at the event and also giving his own views. Supposing if I have written the biography of Sri Deve Gowda, or if he himself has written his autobiography, there is a possibility of our being biased. We were a part of the entire story. So when we write, we tend to become maybe partial. The advantage which Sugata had is that he has not been a party to any of this act. He has the advantage of standing outside after 25 years, looking at what has happened and making an assessment. It's not easy, but he has done a very good job. The one thing which I appreciate is there is nothing in writing. There is no document about any politician of Karnataka. Karnataka has produced a large number of politicians who have started in Karnataka and went on to Government of India and did some good work there. But about none of them we have got any book. The only book I saw, maybe others can correct me, is the autobiography of Nijalingappa. It has been published somewhere in the year 2000. Other than that, I have not seen any book in English talking about the chief ministers of Karnataka or any prominent politician in Karnataka. This is something in a federal system, the state is as important as the center. We write about the central government, we write about the prime ministers, but we don't write about any politician in the state. Now this will start a new trend. We will start respecting the people. I understand only in Tamil Nadu there is an attempt now to write the biography of Mr. Karunanidhi in English. I don't know whether it has come out or not. At least somebody says that we will write. But this is the starter now. This has given a very good idea, and as Chiranjiv very rightly said, it has projected Mr. Deve Gowda not as a politician only, but also as an excellent human being. I have the honor of working with him for several years. I have noticed a number of good qualities in him which have all been reflected very truly in this book. I did not tell that to him. He himself found out and wrote all that. The thing which I liked most in Mr. Deve Gowda, which probably had missed in this book, is his magnanimity. Once he told me, when we were talking about an officer, he told me a sentence which I still remember. He said, ದೇವರು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಜಾಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಇಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾನೆ, ನಾವು ಸಣ್ಣತನ ತೋರಿಸಬಾರದು. When there is a possibility of hitting a person, there was a very good chance. I talked to him, sir, what do we do in this case? Then he gave me this. We shall not be small. Let us do something big. God has given us a position and we must make use of it for the good of the people and not to punish any person. This is a lesson which I learnt from him. See, in a democracy, the relationship between the bureaucrat and the politician is always difficult. Sometimes it is very good, sometimes it is not. I must say with Mr. Deve Gowda, I never had a single minute where I felt bad for working with a politician. That is the great quality. The second thing which the book covers very clearly his trust in his officers. I miss Mr. T.R. Satish Chandran now. In fact, he is the more appropriate person to come and talk to you in this gathering than me. Unfortunately, since he is no more, I have to say something about him also. He is the person who can give his opinion very frankly, and Mr. Deve Gowda used to respect his views. That is something great in a politician. It was never the case where he overruled him. If there is any difference of opinion between the principal secretary and the PM, that will be sent to me. And Sri Deve Gowda will tell me, can you go and tell Mr. Satish Chandran and ask him to reconsider this? He will not overrule him on the file. He has never overruled. I will have to go back and find a compromise between the two and ensure that what is good for the people is carried out. This is something very good in him, the trust. I have a number of stories to say, but I will not say that now. He has a great trust in his officers, and he once told me, I believe in my officers. Without them, I cannot work. Supposing, I asked him once, supposing if they double cross, what will you do? He said, no, I will not keep such a person in my office. Before taking a person into my office, I do a lot of research. And once I take him, I trust him. And that has always been the case. We were happy to work with him. One other thing which I noticed in the book is something very good. How he takes his success as well as defeat in the same way. See, many of us get worried when we lose. But Sri Deve Gowda had never been having that. Even after being the Prime Minister, he lost a couple of elections. But he did not lose his heart. As Chiranjiv said, he will come back and he will get along very well with the people. It has been a great pleasure working with him. And I am glad that the book captures all these good qualities and also mentions whatever be the problems, the Brutus Act, all that comes in the book very beautifully. It is a very difficult job. I think he must have interviewed some 50, 60 people or more. 80 people. And not only his interview, he has cross-checked also. I read in his book, whatever I said about Mr. Chidambaram and Mr. Deve Gowda, he has cross-checked with Mr. Chidambaram, and he makes a reply saying that I don't remember it exactly, but if Mr. Deve Gowda and Mr. Meenakshisundaram have said this, that must be correct. I will agree with that. So to that extent, he has made a cross-check and ensured that whatever is true comes out in the book. So I am very happy about reading this book. The only one shortcoming which I noticed was the book is very large. You can't read it in one go. It will take at least about a week for you. A person like me who is very much involved in this, I could not read the book in one go. But I sympathize with him. Taking the life of a person who has been very active over 60 to 70 years, you can't put that in 100 pages. You do need some 500, 600 pages to capture. So I realize the problem. No harm in that. We will read the book. If it takes 1 week, so what? We will spend the time and read it carefully. And it's a very good book. As Charanjeev said, this is going to be a trendsetter for future things to come. 1, people writing about state leaders. 2, people writing about a politician as a human being. These are things which will come. I wish you all the best and thank you very much for giving us an opportunity of meeting the people here. Thank you very much.
Can I request Mr. B.L. Shankar to say a few words, please?
ಎಲ್ರಿಗೂ ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ನ್ಯಾಯ ಒದಗಿಸ್ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಂದರೆ ಕನಿಷ್ಠ ಒಬ್ಬರಾದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಲೇಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ನಾನು ನಿಂತಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಮೀನಾಕ್ಷಿಸುಂದರಂ ಹೇಳಿದರು 600 ಪುಟ ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಯಿತು ಅಂಥೇಳಿ. 60 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಸುದೀರ್ಘ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡಿದಂಥವ್ರನ್ನ 600 ಪುಟದಲ್ಲಿ ಕಟ್ಟಿಕೊಡೋದು ಕೂಡ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಕಷ್ಟವಾದ ಕೆಲಸ. ಅದನ್ನು ಸುಗತ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗೇ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಸುಗತ ಅಟಲ್ಜಿ ಮತ್ತು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ನಡುವೆ ನಡೆದಂಥ ಮಾತುಕತೆಗಳನ್ನ ಪ್ರಸ್ತಾಪ ಮಾಡುವಾಗ ನೀವು ಒಂದು ಅಂಶವನ್ನು ಗಮನಿಸಿರಬೇಕು. 1991ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಹಾಸನದಿಂದ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಬಾರಿಗೆ ಲೋಕಸಭೆಗೆ ಅವರು ಹೋದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಮೊದಲನೇ ವಿಷಯ ಅವರು ಎತ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದು ಕಾವೇರಿ. 1962ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ವಿಧಾನಸಭೆಗೆ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಬಾರಿಗೆ ಒಬ್ಬ ಬಂಡಾಯ ಅಭ್ಯರ್ಥಿಯಾಗಿ ಹೊಳೆನರಸೀಪುರ ಕ್ಷೇತ್ರದಿಂದ ಆಯ್ಕೆಯಾಗಿ ವಿಧಾನಸಭೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಮಾಡಿದಂಥ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಭಾಷಣವೂ ಕೂಡ ಕಾವೇರಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆನೇ ಇತ್ತು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಶಾಸಕರಾದರೂ ಕಾವೇರಿನೇ, ಸಂಸದರಾದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಕಾವೇರಿನೇ, ಯಾವುದೇ ಸದನ ಆದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಅದು ಕಾವೇರಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆನೇ ಅವರ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಮಾತು. ಅದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಇಷ್ಟೇ, ಅವರ ಬದ್ಧತೆ ಏನಿದ್ರೂ ಕೂಡ ರೈತರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ನೀರಾವರಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ಹಳ್ಳಿಗಾಡಿನ ಬದುಕಿನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. ಒಂದು ವಿಪರ್ಯಾಸ ನನಗೆ ಕಂಡಿದ್ದು ಪೆಂಗ್ವಿನ್ನವರು ಸುಗತ ಸೇರಿ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದು ಅಂದರೆ ಪುಸ್ತಕ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ವಿಷಯ ಹಳ್ಳಿಗಾಡಿನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ, ಬರೆದಿರೋದು ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷ್ನಲ್ಲಿ, ಬರೆದಿರೋದು ಸುಗತ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸರಾಜು, ರಿಲೀಸ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರೋದು ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಇಂಟರ್ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಸೆಂಟರು ಮತ್ತು ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಎಂಡ್ ಹೋಟೆಲ್ನಲ್ಲಿ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ತದ್ವಿರುದ್ಧವಾಗಿರುವಂಥ ಕಾರ್ಯಕ್ರಮಗಳಿವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ. ಅವರಿಗೆ ಆಯ್ಕೆಯನ್ನು ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದರೆ ಅವರು ಒಂದೋ ಹಾಸನದ ಯಾವುದಾದ್ರು ಒಂದು ಸ್ಟೇಡಿಯಂನಲ್ಲಿ, ಅಥವಾ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿನ ಯಾವುದಾದ್ರು ಒಂದು ಮೈದಾನದಲ್ಲಿ, ಅಥವಾ ಇನ್ಯಾವುದಾದ್ರು ಒಂದು ರಾಮನಗರನೋ ಚನ್ನಪಟ್ಟಣನೋ ಆಯ್ಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಜನಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಅದು ಬಿಡುಗಡೆ ಆಗಲಿ ಅಂಥೇಳಿ ನಿರೀಕ್ಷೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ಕಾರಣ, ಭಾರತದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಅಪರೂಪವಾಗಿ ಕಾಣುವಂಥವ್ರು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು. ಬಹುತೇಕ ದಾವೋಸಿಗೆ ಹೋದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೇ ಪಂಚೆ ಇದೇ ಜುಬ್ಬ ಹಾಕ್ಕೊಂಡೇ ಹೋದಂಥ ಅಪರೂಪದ ಪ್ರಧಾನಮಂತ್ರಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ಕೂಡ ಒಬ್ಬರು. ಯಾವತ್ತೂ ಕೂಡ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಅಧಿಕಾರ, ಸ್ಥಾನಮಾನ ಅಥವಾ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಗಳು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವದ ಮೇಲೆ ಯಾವುದೇ ಬದಲಾವಣೆಯನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಅನೇಕ ಬಾರಿ ನಾನು ಅವ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಮಾತಾಡುವಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಅದೃಷ್ಟನೋ ದುರಾದೃಷ್ಟನೋ ಗೊತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, 62ರಲ್ಲಿ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಮಾಡಿದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ನನಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗದೆ ಇರುವಂಥ ವಿಷಯ, ಯಾಕೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೆ ಅವತ್ತು ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಂದ ಸ್ಪರ್ಧೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಡಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ. ಅದರಿಂದ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗಾದಂಥ ನಷ್ಟ ಏನಿಲ್ಲ, ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೆ ದೊಡ್ಡ ನಷ್ಟ ಆಯಿತು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಈಗ ನನಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇರುವಂಥ ವಿಚಾರ. ಅವತ್ತು ಅವ್ರಿಗಿನ್ನೂ 28-29 ವರ್ಷ, ಯಾರಿಗೂ ಪ್ರತಿಸ್ಪರ್ಧಿ ಆಗಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು. ಆದರೂ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ನಿರಾಕರಿಸಿದರು. ಬಹುತೇಕ ಅವರು ಭಾಳ ವಿಧಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಂಬಿಕೆ ಇಟ್ಟಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು, ದೇವರಲ್ಲಿ ನಂಬಿಕೆ ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು. ಅವರ ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ ನಕ್ಷತ್ರವೇ ಆ ಥರ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ. ಹೋರಾಟದಿಂದಲೇ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಸ್ವಂತ ಪ್ರತಿಭೆಯಿಂದ, ಸ್ವಂತ ಹೋರಾಟದಿಂದಲೇ ಗಳಿಸಬೇಕೇ ಹೊರತಾಗಿ ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ಬರ ಮರ್ಜಿಯಿಂದ ಗಳಿಸಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಅವರಿಗಿದ್ದಂಥ ಒಂದು ವಿಧಿ ಅಂತ ಕಾಣ್ತದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಅವತ್ತಿನಿಂದ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಮಾಡಿ 62ರಲ್ಲಿ ಪ್ರಾರಂಭ ಹೋದಂಥ ಹೋರಾಟ 2021ರಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ನಿಂತೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಅದೇ ರೀತಿ ಹೋರಾಟದ ಬದುಕೆ ಬರ್ತಾಯಿದೆ. ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಂದು ಹಂತದಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಹೋರಾಟ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಒಬ್ಬ ಭಾರತದ ಅಥವಾ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಒಬ್ಬ ಎದುರಾಳಿ ಯಾವ ಥರ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಂದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಥರನೇ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಅಪೇಕ್ಷೆ ಪಡಬೇಕು. ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ವಾದ ಮಾಡೋದ್ರಿಂದ, ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಪ್ರತಿಸ್ಪರ್ಧಿ ಆಗೋದ್ರಿಂದ, ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಮುಖಾಮುಖಿ ಆಗೋದ್ರಿಂದ ನಮ್ಮ ತಿಳುವಳಿಕೆ, ನಮ್ಮ ಜ್ಞಾನ, ನಮ್ಮ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವ ಬೆಳೀತದೆ ಹೊರತಾಗಿ ಅದರಿಂದ ನಷ್ಟ ಆಗುವಂಥದ್ದು ಏನೂ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನೋದು ನಾನು ಅರ್ಥಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ವಿಚಾರ. ಮೊನ್ನೆ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಲಿಟ್ರರಿ ಫೆಸ್ಟಿವಲ್ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೀತಾ ಇದೆ. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಸುಗತನು ಭಾಗವಹಿಸಿದ್ದು, ಅವರು ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದು ನಾನು ಓದಿದೆ. ಸುಗತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು ಕೆಲವು ಪತ್ರಿಕೆಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಡ್ಲೈನ್ ಬಂದಿತ್ತು, ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಜಾತಿವಾದಿ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅಲ್ವಾ. ನೀವು ಹೇಳಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಜಾತಿವಾದಿ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ. ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲ, 60 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಕಾಲ 6 ದಶಕಗಳ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡಿದ ನಂತರವೂ ಕೂಡ ಇವತ್ತು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಜಾತಿವಾದಿ ಹೌದೋ ಅಲ್ಲೋ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಸರ್ಟಿಫಿಕೇಟ್ ಕೊಡಬೇಕಂತ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಉತ್ತರ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಪರನೋ ವಿರೋಧ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ವಿಮರ್ಶೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಂತ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಯಾವ ರೀತಿಯ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಅನ್ನತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಣೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಂತ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಇರೋದು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಅವರ ಬದುಕಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಡೆದಂಥ ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ವಿಪರ್ಯಾಸ. ನಾನು ಕಾನೂನು ಓದಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಿಗೆ ಬಂದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ವಿರೋಧ ಪಕ್ಷದ ನಾಯಕರಾಗಿದ್ದರು. ಕುತೂಹಲಕ್ಕೋಸ್ಕರ ನಾವು ಆಗಾಗ ಶಾಸನ ಸಭೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗಿ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಮತ್ತು ದೇವರಾಜ ಅರಸರ ಮಧ್ಯ ನಡೆಯುವಂಥ ವಾದ ವಿವಾದಗಳು, ಪ್ರತಿವಾದಗಳನ್ನು ಕೇಳೋದೇ ಅದೊಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಷನ್ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ನೋಡಿದಾಗೆ ಆಗುವಂಥ ಒಂದು ಸಂದರ್ಭಗಳವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೂ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಷನ್ ಸಿನಿಮಾ ಅಂದರೆ ಇಷ್ಟ ಇತ್ತು ಆಗ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಅದು ನೋಡೋಂಥ ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭ ಅದಾದ ನಂತರ JP ಚಳುವಳಿ, ಅದಾದ ನಂತರ ಜನತಾ ಪಾರ್ಟಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ಆದಾಗ ಒಂದು ಸರ್ತಿ ನಾನು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಸಿಂಧ್ಯಾರವರು ಮೈಸೂರಿಗೆ ಒಂದು ಮದುವೆಗೆ ಹೋಗಿದ್ವಿ. ಆಗ ಒಂದು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಪಕ್ಷದ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರಾಗಿದ್ದರು. ಪ್ಲೈಮತ್ ಕಾರ್ ಇತ್ತು ಒಂದು ಪಕ್ಷದ ಅಧ್ಯಕ್ಷರಿಗೆ. ಮೈಸೂರಿಗೆ ಹೋಗಿ ವಾಪಸ್ ಬರಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಶ್ರೀರಂಗಪಟ್ಟಣದ ಹತ್ರ ಕಾರ್ ಕೆಟ್ಟೋಗಿ ದಾರಿಲಿ ನಿಂತಿದ್ವಿ. ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸ ಪ್ರಸಾದ್ ಮದುವೆ ಅಂತ ನೆನಪು ನನಗೆ. ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಸಿಂಧ್ಯಾನವ್ರನ್ನ ಕೇಳ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು, ಏನು ಇವನು ಶಂಕರ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಮದುವೆ ಮನೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಂಸಾಹಾರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ನಲ್ಲ, ಏನು ಇವನ ಸಮಾಚಾರ ಇವಂದು ಅಂತ ಕೇಳ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು. ಅಷ್ಟೊತ್ತಿಗೆ ನನಗೂ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೂ ಪರಿಚಯ ಆಗಿ 4-5 ವರ್ಷ ಆಗಿ ಹೋಗಿತ್ತು. ಆಗಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಆ ಮದುವೆ ಮನೇಲಿ ನಾನು ಮಾಂಸಾಹಾರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದನ್ನು ನೋಡಿ ಅವ್ರು ಏನು ಇವನು, ಅವ್ರು ಬಹುತೇಕ ಇವನು ಒಕ್ಕಲಿಗ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಇವನು ಯಾರೋ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣ, ಶೃಂಗೇರಿ ಚಿಕ್ಕಮಗಳೂರು ಕಡೆನೂ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣ ಮತ್ತೊಂದೇನೋ ಇರಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಸಸ್ಯಾಹಾರ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಏನು ಸರ್ ನೀವು, ಅವನು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಚಿಕ್ಕಮಗಳೂರು ಮೂಡಿಗೆರೆ ಒಕ್ಕಲಿಗ ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಹೇಳಿದರು. ಅಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ನಾನು ಅವರು ಒಟ್ಟಿಗೆ 4-5 ವರ್ಷ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡಿದ ನಂತರನೂ ಕೂಡ ನಾನು ಯಾವ ಮೂಲದವನು, ಯಾವುದು ನನ್ನ ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ್ದು, ಏನು ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ಗ್ರೌಂಡ್ ಮತ್ತೊಂದು ಗೊತ್ತಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಅಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಅವರು ಒಬ್ಬನಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಮರ್ಥ್ಯ ಇತ್ತೋ, ಶಕ್ತಿ ಇತ್ತೋ ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಡ್ತಾಯಿದ್ರು, ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೆ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಉತ್ತರ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ, ದಕ್ಷಿಣ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ ಬಂದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಬಹುತೇಕ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ, ಯಾಕೆ ಭಾರತದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲೇ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಷ್ಟು ಪರೀಕ್ಷಿಸಲ್ಪಟ್ಟಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮತ್ತೊಬ್ಬ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಇದ್ದಾನೆ ಅಂತ ನಾನು ಯಾವತ್ತೂ ಕೂಡ ಭಾವಿಸಿಲ್ಲ. ಈ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನ ಹೇಳೋದ್ರಿಂದ ರಾಜಕೀಯವಾಗಿ ನನಗೆ ಈ ಸ್ಥಿತಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ಲಾಭವೂ ಇಲ್ಲ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೆ ನಾನು ಹೇಳದೆ ಹೋದರೆ ಏನು ನಷ್ಟವೂ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಅವರು ಆ ಮಟ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಬೆಳೆದು ಹೋಗ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಇವತ್ತು 6 ದಶಕಗಳ ರಾಜಕಾರಣವನ್ನು ನೀವೇನಾದರೂ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಣೆ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣನ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಣೆ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಅವರ ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಾಧನೆ. ಅಧಿಕಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಎಷ್ಟಿದ್ದರೂ ಬೇರೆ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ. ಇವತ್ತು 62ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಸನಸಭೆಯನ್ನು ಪ್ರವೇಶ ಮಾಡಿದವರಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹುತೇಕ ಇಬ್ಬರೇ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ಎಸ್.ಎಂ. ಕೃಷ್ಣರವರು ಮತ್ತು ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು. ಆದರೆ ಸಕ್ರಿಯ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಒಬ್ಬರೇ. ಹಾಗೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಸಂಖ್ಯೆ ಇದೆ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡದೇ ಇರೋರ ಸಂಖ್ಯೆಯೂ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಪ್ರಮಾಣದಲ್ಲಿದೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ. ಆದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನ ನಿರ್ಲಕ್ಷ್ಯ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ವರ್ಗ ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದಿಲ್ಲ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ. ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನಿರ್ಲಕ್ಷ್ಯ ಮಾಡಿ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಸಾಧ್ಯ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನೋಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯನ್ನು ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡದಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಾಧನೆ. 6 ದಶಕಗಳ ಕಾಲ 60 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಕಾಲ ಪ್ರಸ್ತುತರಾಗಿ ಉಳಿಯತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಭಾಳ ಸುಲಭದ ಕೆಲಸ ಏನಲ್ಲ ಇವತ್ತಿನ ದಿನಮಾನದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ. ಅದೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಅವರು ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅನೇಕ ಸರಿಯಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ನಿರ್ಧಾರಗಳನ್ನು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅನೇಕ ನಿರ್ಧಾರಗಳು ತಪ್ಪು ಅಂತ ನಂತರವೂ ಕೂಡ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗಿದೆ ಅವರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವದಲ್ಲಿ, ಅವರ ಜೀವನದ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಹೋರಾಟದಲ್ಲಿ. ಇಲ್ಲದೆ ಹೋಗಿದ್ದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಂಥ ಒಬ್ಬ ಹೋರಾಟಗಾರ, ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಂಥ ಬದ್ಧತೆ ಇರುವಂಥ ಒಬ್ಬ ನಾಯಕ, ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಷ್ಟು ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣವಾಗಿ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಬದುಕಿಗೆ ಸಮರ್ಪಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು 60 ವರ್ಷಗಳ ಸುದೀರ್ಘ ಶಾಸನಸಭೆ ಸಂಸತ್ತಿನ ಅನುಭವದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೇವಲ 5-6 ವರ್ಷ ಮಾತ್ರ ಸರ್ಕಾರದ ಭಾಗವಾಗಿ ಉಳಿತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ನಿರ್ಮಾಣ ಆಗಿದ್ದು ಈ ದೇಶದ, ಈ ರಾಜ್ಯದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಲೋಪಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು ಅಂತಾದರೂ ಕೂಡ ನಾನು ಭಾವಿಸ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಯಸ್ತೇನೆ. ಇವತ್ತಿನ ದಿನಮಾನದಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಸಕರಾದ ಕೂಡಲೇ ಸಚಿವರಾಗಬೇಕು, ಸಚಿವರಾಗಿ ಆದ ತಕ್ಷಣವೇ ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿ ಆಗಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಿ ಬಯಸ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವರಿಗೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು 62ರಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾಸಕರಾಗಿ 83ರಲ್ಲಿ ಮೊದಲನೇ ಬಾರಿಗೆ ಸಚಿವರಾದರು, 85ರಲ್ಲಿ 2ನೇ ಬಾರಿ ಸಚಿವರಾದರು. ಭಾಳ ಸಮಯ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಮತ್ತು ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿ ಆಗಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ 94ರವರೆಗೂ ಕಾಯಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಅಕಸ್ಮಾತ್ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಿಂದ ಪ್ರಥಮ ಪ್ರಧಾನಿ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಹೆಮ್ಮೆ ನಮ್ಮೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಇದ್ದರೂ ಕೂಡ ಅಕಸ್ಮಾತ್ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ಮುಖ್ಯಮಂತ್ರಿಯಾಗೇ ಮುಂದುವರೆದಿದ್ದರೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದ ಇತಿಹಾಸನೇ ಬೇರೆ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು ಅನ್ನೋದು ನನ್ನ ಖಚಿತವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯ. ಇದನ್ನು ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೀನಿ ಸುಗತ ಅವ್ರ ಹತ್ರ. ನನಗೇನು ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ತದೋ ಅಷ್ಟನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಸಂತೋಷದ ವಿಷಯ ಅಂದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಅದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲದನ್ನೂ ಕೂಡ ಓದಿದಾರಂತೆ. ಓದಿ ಇಲ್ಲ ನ್ಯಾಯಯುತವಾಗಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿದ್ದಾನೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದರಂತೆ. ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ ಎಲ್ಲವೂ ಕೂಡ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಪರವಾಗೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವವನ್ನು ವಿಮರ್ಶೆ ಮಾಡಿದಂಥ ಅನೇಕ ಮಾತುಗಳನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ನಾನು ಆಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಅವರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವವನ್ನು ವಿಮರ್ಶೆ ಮಾಡುವಷ್ಟು ದೊಡ್ಡವನು ನಾನು ಅಲ್ಲದೆ ಹೋದರೂ ಕೂಡ, ಆದರೆ ನನಗೆ ಸರಿ ಅಂದ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದನ್ನು ನಾನು ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಎಷ್ಟರ ಮಟ್ಟಿನ ಸಲಿಗೆಯನ್ನು ನಮಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದರು ಅಂದರೆ ಇವತ್ತಿನ ರಾಜಕಾರಣ, ಇವತ್ತಿನ ನಾಯಕರುಗಳನ್ನ ಭೇಟಿ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಪಡುವಂಥ ಪರಿಪಾಠಗಳನ್ನ ನೋಡಿದಾಗ ಅವರು ಮನೆಗೆ ಬಾಗಿಲು ಹಾಕ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದೆ ಬಹುತೇಕ ಮಲಗಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ಬಾಗಿಲು ಹಾಕ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು ಬಿಟ್ಟರೆ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಎದ್ದರೆ ರಾತ್ರಿ ಮಲಗೋವರೆಗೂ ಇಲ್ಲವೇ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಶೇವಿಂಗ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾಗಲೂ ಜನವಾಗಿ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದದ್ದು ನಾನು ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಊಟ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾಗಂತೂ ಸುತ್ತ 10 ಜನ ಇಲ್ಲದಿದ್ದರೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಊಟನೇ ಸೇರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಈ ಥರದ ಅನೇಕ ಸರಳತೆಯ ನಡವಳಿಕೆಗಳನ್ನು ನಾನು ಅವರಲ್ಲಿ ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಆದರೆ ದುರಾದೃಷ್ಟ ಅಂತೇಳಂದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸಾಮರ್ಥ್ಯದ, ಅನುಭವದ ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣ ಸದ್ಬಳಕೆ ಆಗಲಿಲ್ವಲ್ಲ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಮತ್ತು ಭಾರತದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಒಂದು ಕೊರಗು ಇವತ್ತೂ ಕೂಡ ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಕಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಅಕಸ್ಮಾತು 69ರಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಇಬ್ಬಾಗಾದಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಯಾರು 2 ಬಾರಿ ಟಿಕೆಟನ್ನು ನಿರಾಕರಿಸಿದ್ರೋ ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಸೇರೋದ್ರ ಬದಲಿಗೆ ಬೇರೆ ನಿರ್ಧಾರನೇ ಮಾಡಿದರೆ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಷ್ಟೇ ಅಲ್ಲ ಭಾರತದ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದ ಚಿತ್ರಣವೂ ಬೇರೆ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು. ಆದರೆ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ಸಿಗೊಂದು ಪರ್ಯಾಯವಾದಂಥ ಪಕ್ಷವನ್ನು ಕಟ್ಟುವಂಥದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರು ವಹಿಸಿದಂಥ ಪರಿಶ್ರಮಕ್ಕೆ ಹಿನ್ನಡೆ ಆಗ್ತಾಯಿತ್ತು ಅನ್ನೋದು ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಮಟ್ಟಿನ ಸತ್ಯ. ಆದರೆ ಬದ್ಧತೆ ಇರುವಂಥವ್ರು, ಅಧಿಕಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಎಂದೂ ಕೂಡ ರಾಜಿ ಮಾಡಿಕೊಳ್ಳದೇ ಇದ್ದಂಥವ್ರು, ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಸುದೀರ್ಘವಾದಂಥ ರಾಜಕೀಯ ಬದುಕಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಎಷ್ಟು ಸ್ನೇಹಿತರನ್ನು ಗಳಿಸಿದಾರೋ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ವಿರೋಧಿಗಳನ್ನು ಗಳಿಸ್ಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅಪರೂಪವಾದಂಥ ಒಂದು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವ. ಯಾರೇ ಆದರೂ ಕೂಡ 1933ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿ ಮೇ 18ನೇ ತಾರೀಕು ಹುಟ್ಟಿದ ಮುಂದಿನ ವರ್ಷ ಬಂದರೆ 90ಕ್ಕೆ ಕಾಲಿಡ್ತಾರೆ ಮೇ 18ಕ್ಕೆ. ಈ ಕ್ಷಣದಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಸವಾಲುಗಳನ್ನ ಸ್ವೀಕರಿಸೋದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಅವರಿಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಧೈರ್ಯ ಮತ್ತು ಸಾಹಸ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಬಹಳ ಅಪರೂಪವಾಗಿರತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಸುಗತ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸರಾಜು ಅವರು ಹಲವು ಬಾರಿ ನನ್ನ ಹತ್ರ ಈ ಪುಸ್ತಕವನ್ನು ಬರೆಯುವಂಥ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತಾಡಿದರು, ಚರ್ಚೆ ಮಾಡಿದರು, ಅನೇಕ ವಿಷಯಗಳನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿದರು. ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಧ್ಯವಾದಷ್ಟು ನಾನು ಅವರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವವನ್ನು ವಿಮರ್ಶಾತ್ಮಕವಾಗಿಯೇ ನೋಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ ಹೊರತು ನಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಬೆಳೆಸಿದಂಥ, ನಮಗೆ ಅವಕಾಶ ಕೊಟ್ಟಂಥ ಒಬ್ಬರು ನಾಯಕರು ಅನ್ನೋ ಕಾರಣಕ್ಕೆ ಅವರ ನಿಜವಾದಂಥ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ಚ್ಯುತಿ ಬರುವಂಥ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ಮಾತನ್ನು ಹೇಳುವಂಥ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವನ್ನು ನಾನು ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ. ತಪ್ಪಿದ್ದರೆ ತಪ್ಪು, ಸರಿ ಇದ್ದರೆ ಸರಿ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತನ್ನೇ ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲೂ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಆದರೆ ಬಲವಾಗಿ ವಿಧಿನಲ್ಲಿ ನಂಬಿಕೆ ಇರತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಅವರು ಎಲ್ಲ ನಿರ್ಧಾರಗಳು ಅವರು ತೆಗೆದುಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದು ವಿಧಿಯ ಕಾರಣ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಆ ನಿರ್ಧಾರಕ್ಕೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ತೀರ್ಮಾನಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಿರತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಬಯೋಗ್ರಫಿ ವಿಚಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಚಿರಂಜೀವಿ ಸಿಂಗ್ ಅವರು ಮತ್ತು ಮೀನಾಕ್ಷಿಸುಂದರಂ ಅವರು ಹೇಳಿದಂಥ ಮಾತು ಸತ್ಯ. ಬಯೋಗ್ರಫಿ ಬರೀತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದಷ್ಟು ಸುಲಭ ಸಾಧ್ಯವಾಗಿರತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದಲ್ಲ. ಅದು ಕೂಡ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಂಥ ಒಂದು ಭಾಳ ಕ್ಲಿಷ್ಟಕರವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ, ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಕಷ್ಟವಾಗಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಒಂದು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವವನ್ನು ಕಟ್ಟಿಕೊಡೋದು ಅಂದರೆ ಸುಲಭ ಅಂತೂ ಅಲ್ಲವೇ ಅಲ್ಲ. ಅದು ಬೇರೆಯವ್ರದ್ದೆಲ್ಲ ಭಾಳಷ್ಟು ವಿಷಯಗಳು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಬಂದಿರ್ಬೋದು. ಆದರೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಒಂದು ದೃಷ್ಟಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತರ್ಮುಖಿ. ನಾನು ಕಂಡಾಗೆ ಅನೇಕ ವಿಷಯಗಳನ್ನ ತಾವೇ ನುಂಗ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ತಾವೇ ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ಬರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ಅದನ್ನು ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಳ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ಅಪರೂಪ. ಅತ್ಯಂತ ನನಗೆ ಪರಿಚಯ ಆದ ನಂತರ, ಅದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಮುಂಚೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಕಷ್ಟದ ದಿನಗಳಿದ್ದು ಅದು ಬೇರೆ ವಿಷಯ. ಆದರೆ ನನಗೆ ಪರಿಚಯ ಆದ ನಂತರ, ಅವರು ನನ್ನ ಭಾಳ ಆತ್ಮೀಯರಾದ ನಂತರ ಅನೇಕ ಕಷ್ಟದ ದಿನಗಳನ್ನು ರಾಜಕೀಯದಲ್ಲೂ ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ವೈಯಕ್ತಿಕ ಬದುಕಿನಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅವರು 1989ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿಯಿಂದ 1991ನೇ ಇಸ್ವಿ ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ಸದಸ್ಯರಾಗಿ ಆಯ್ಕೆಯಾಗಲಿವರೆಗೆ ಪಟ್ಟಂಥ ಪರಿಪಾಟ್ಲಿದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಯಾವ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಬರಬಾರ್ದು ಅಂಥ ಸ್ಥಿತಿಯನ್ನು ಅವರು ಅನುಭವಿಸಿದ್ದನ್ನು ಆ 2-3 ವರ್ಷ ಅವ್ರ ಜೊತೆ ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲೂ ಇದ್ದವರಾಗಿ ನಾನು ಕೂಡ ಅರ್ಥಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಆ ಸಂದರ್ಭದಲ್ಲೂ ಕೂಡ ಎದೆಗುಂತಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದು ಕೂಡ ಪುಸ್ತಕದ ಒಂದು ಭಾಗವಾಗಿಯೇ ಬಂದಿದೆ. ಇದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಇಷ್ಟೇ, ಅನೇಕ ಜನ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಕ್ರಿಯರಾಗಿರೋರು ಇಲ್ಲಿದ್ದೀರಿ, ಕಾರ್ಯಾಂಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು ಇದ್ದೀರಿ, ನ್ಯಾಯಾಂಗದಲ್ಲಿ ಕೆಲಸ ಮಾಡ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವ್ರು ಇದ್ದೀರಿ. ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಒಬ್ಬ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿ ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಬದುಕು, ಒಬ್ಬ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿಯ ಸಾರ್ವಜನಿಕ ಬದುಕಿನ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಇವತ್ತು ಬರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತುಗಳು, ಇವತ್ತಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಅಭಿಪ್ರಾಯಗಳು ಏನಿದ್ದಾವೋ ಅದು ಹಾಗೇ ಇರಲಿ. ಅದರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅನೇಕ ವಿಶ್ಲೇಷಣೆಗಳಿದ್ದಾವೆ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ. ಇವತ್ತು ಎಲ್ಲರನ್ನೂ ಕೂಡ ಪರ್ಸೆಂಟೇಜ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಅಳಿತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಪ್ರಯತ್ನವನ್ನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ನಾನು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಆತ್ಮವಿಶ್ವಾಸದಿಂದ ದೃಢವಾಗಿ ಹೇಳಬಲ್ಲೆ, ಆ ಪರ್ಸೆಂಟೇಜ್ ರಾಜಕಾರಣದಿಂದ ಹೊರತಾಗಿದ್ದ ಒಬ್ಬ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಇದ್ದರೆ ಅದು ಮಾನ್ಯ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಅನ್ನೋದನ್ನು ನಾನು ಅನುಭವದಿಂದ ಕಂಡುಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥವನ್ನನ್ನು ನಾನು ನಂಬಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಮನಸ್ಸು ಮಾಡಿದರೆ ಅವರು ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ರಾಷ್ಟ್ರೀಯ ಪಕ್ಷವನ್ನೇ ಕಟ್ಟುವಷ್ಟು ಸಂಪರ್ಕ, ಸಾಧನಗಳು ಅವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ಇದ್ದಿದ್ದು ನಾನು ಗಮನಿಸಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಆದರೆ ಯಾವತ್ತೂ ಕೂಡ ತನ್ನ ಸಹಿಯನ್ನು ಮಾರ್ಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ರಾಜಕಾರಣಿ ಮಾನ್ಯ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರು ಅಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದು ನಾನು ಕಂಡುಕೊಂಡಿರ್ತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಸತ್ಯ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಮಾನ್ಯ ಸುಗತ ಶ್ರೀನಿವಾಸರಾಜು ಅವರಿಗೆ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರನ್ನ ಇಷ್ಟು ಅಚ್ಚುಕಟ್ಟಾಗಿ ಕಟ್ಟಿಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ ಅಭಿನಂದನೆಗಳನ್ನು ಸಲ್ಲಿಸ್ತೇನೆ. ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ನ್ಯಾಯ ಸಲ್ಲಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಂದರೆ ಈ ಎಲ್ಲ ವಿಷಯಗಳು ಕೂಡ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ತರ್ಜುಮೆಯಾಗಿ ಬಂದರೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ದೊಡ್ಡ ನ್ಯಾಯವನ್ನು ಅದು ಕೊಟ್ಟಾಗ ಆಗ್ತದೆ ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥ ಮಾತನ್ನು ಹೇಳಿ, ಈ ವಿಚಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೇ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡಿದರೆ ಅವರ ವ್ಯಕ್ತಿತ್ವಕ್ಕೆ ಸಂಪೂರ್ಣ ನ್ಯಾಯ ಕೊಟ್ಟಂಗೆ ಆಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಮಾತೃಶ್ರೀ ಚೆನ್ನಮ್ಮನವರು ಕೂಡ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರ ಈ ಒಂದು ದೊಡ್ಡ ಸುದೀರ್ಘ ಪಯಣದ ಹಾದಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಅತ್ಯಂತ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಒಂದು ಶಕ್ತಿಯಾಗಿ ಯಾರಾದರೂ ಅವರೊಟ್ಟಿಗೆ ನಿಂತಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾತೃಶ್ರೀ ಚೆನ್ನಮ್ಮನವರು ಅಂತಕ್ಕಂಥದ್ದನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಈಗ ನಾನು ಅತ್ಯಂತ ಕೃತಜ್ಞತೆಯಿಂದ ಸ್ಮರಿಸಿಕೊಂಡು ಮಾನ್ಯ ದೇವೇಗೌಡರಿಗೆ ಮತ್ತು ಮಾತೃಶ್ರೀ ಚೆನ್ನಮ್ಮನವರಿಗೆ ನನ್ನ ಪ್ರಣಾಮಗಳನ್ನು ಸಲ್ಲಿಸಿ ಅವಕಾಶಕ್ಕೆ ವಂದಿಸಿ ನಾನು ಮಾತನ್ನು ಮುಗಿಸ್ತೇನೆ. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.
Thank you, sir. Now is the time for the panel discussion by our eminent guests present here with us. May I request Mr. Karthik Venkatesh to moderate the discussion, please. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. It is my honor to ask a few questions of these panelists and spend a few minutes trying to talk about the wonderful personality of Mr. Gowda and what Sugata has put into the book. So I will begin my first question with an observation. I would request Sugata to comment on it. This is something that we have discussed in the past. Now, when you look at, now this is the 25th anniversary of Mr. Gowda becoming Prime Minister. He became Prime Minister in 1996, right? And when we look at the history of India from 1947 to 1996 and the Prime Ministers who had preceded Mr. Gowda, you see a pattern. There was, of course, Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi, who were, of course, part of the Gandhi family and, eminent personalities in their own right. The others who had become Prime Minister before Mr. Gowda. When we look at, say, Mr. Moraji Desai, right? He was from the Congress stable, went against the Congress. He was a Brahmin by birth, right? Had a number of years in politics, had spent a number of years in national politics as a minister. If you look at Mr. Charanjeev Singh, right? He was, of course, not a high caste person, right? But still, he was from the Hindi heartland, a Hindi-speaking person from the politically important state of Uttar Pradesh, right? Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, of course, again belonged to the Gandhi family. The first Prime Minister from South India, Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, again a Brahmin by caste, and part of the Congress, enormous cultural capital, very well learned and all of that. So when you look at all these personalities and you look at the personality of Mr. Gowda, right? A rank outsider, not high caste, spent a lot of time in state politics, but had not spent too much time in national politics. And yet, he made it to the highest chair in the country. What would you comment on that? How did this come to pass? How did this happen?
Thank you, Karthik. Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, Mr. Deve Gowda was a rank outsider. And I say in this book that he was one prime minister who reached the highest position without any pelf, patronage or pedigree. And you're right about the other prime ministers. You know, they either had social capital or cultural capital, or were from the Hindi belt, so there was a natural advantage. And even Mr. Narasimha Rao, who came from the south, was from the upper caste, and there was a natural accrual of social and cultural capital. And he had become a very Delhi person by the time he became prime minister. So Mr. Deve Gowda was the only one who did not have any of this infrastructure. I think we should also point out, Mr. Deve Gowda, like Mr. Narendra Modi, was not propelled by any organization. Mr. Modi became prime minister primarily because he had the huge infrastructure of the RSS. So Mr. Deve Gowda was a rank outsider to all of this. And another very important thing that occurred to me, which I mentioned in passing in the book, is there was no other movement which also propelled Mr. Deve Gowda. See, in the south, there was the Justice Party. In Tamil Nadu, there was the Dravidian movement. And all the chief ministers and people who became national players from Tamil Nadu had the support of the Dravidian movement. And there was a long history to the whole thing. Mr. Deve Gowda had none of that either. And he was not a socialist like, say, many of his other colleagues. I write about that in the book as well. He was a very pragmatic person. He was actually a person so pragmatic and so concerned about the poor that it put to shame a lot of his socialist friends and communists. So this was something that people like Surjit and Jyoti Basu had observed over the decades about Mr. Deve Gowda. And therefore they felt extremely confident to make him their nominee as prime minister. So this thing about Mr. Deve Gowda becoming prime minister suddenly, a dark horse, all of that is incorrect, because the decision of the left to sponsor him as their nominee to become prime minister was a very, very reasoned kind of decision.
My next question to you, sir, Mr. Chiranjiv Singh. Justice Venkatachaliah was mentioning about Deve Gowda paddy, and it's something that you have also talked about, earlier. A little detail about that, sir. What is this Deve Gowda paddy? How did it come to be? Some details about it would really help us appreciate and understand that.
Karthik, this is a superfine variety of paddy, which was popular already. But the farmers of Punjab, appreciating what he had done for agriculture and for irrigation, spontaneously started calling that paddy variety as Deve Gowda, because in Punjabi, D-E-V-E, they read it as Deve Gowda. So, in fact, so much so that people had forgotten what the original name of the variety was. And I think that's the finest compliment that could be given to Mr. Gowda. Charan Singh did not get it, though he was propelled as farmer's prime minister and all that, whereas this accolade was given to Mr. Gowda. I think spontaneously, it's not that somebody in the agriculture university or some organization gave it. It was something spontaneous. And it was very interesting. When I went to Punjab, people talking to each other, have you sown Deve Gowda? Or no, we haven't sown Deve Gowda because it doesn't do well here, that sort of thing. And no one in Karnataka knew about it till I wrote about it in my column in Vijay Karnataka. And if I may say so, probably that is the trigger for Sugata also to start looking at Mr. Gowda's trajectory in politics and life from that point onwards, because here is someone who is appreciated more outside than in his own state. So I think that was a great thing. But as, in passing, I would say, as Sugata has written, that he never chose the winning side. The struggling side gave him an identity that a winning side could never have. Now, the Sikhs are notorious for not choosing the winning side, except in the farmers' movement now. So they felt a kind of kinship with him and gave him the superb accolade of naming the variety.
My question to you, Sir Dr. Sundaram. Now, among the things that is not very well known but brought out very in a detailed manner in the book is that Mr. Gowda spent a lot of time in the Northeast, almost immediately after he became Prime Minister, right? It's not very well known, but we hope it will be well known in the future. I'm assuming you were party to those discussions, you were party to those decisions, right? What motivated him to make this trip to the Northeast? He spent something like 5 or 6 days there, which was far more than any Prime Minister had done in the past. Why did he do it?
See, first of all, he identified the areas which have not been visited by the people, which have not been looked after by the previous prime ministers. I think somebody mentioned about J&K. I think Venkatachaliah mentioned that. And he is after several years, he was the first prime minister to go there. Similarly, in the Northeast. But the good thing about him was, he did not want to leave out any one of the states. It was quite a problem for us to organize from the Prime Minister's office. See, his conditions were very tough. He told us that I want to visit all the northeastern states. I do not want to miss even one of them. I want to have a program for each one of the states. See, the mistake which we normally do is we put all of them together and give a package. He said, no, don't give that kind of a package. For each state, let us do something. Which means we have to go to those states. We have to talk to those people. And the PM wanted to talk to those people himself. So you have to do all this. The difficulty is the rains were coming. It was the rainy season. He became the Prime Minister in June, and we were told that this is the season where the rains will start. So we have to plan for that. That is why we prepared a trip for all the 7 days, picked up all the officers along with us. We prepared a plan then and there. It used to be a very tough time. In the morning, the Prime Minister will talk. Then we will have to prepare what exactly has to be done. And very cleverly, we organized entertainment programs in the evening so that when others are busy with the entertainment, we can sit and work. But the only problem with the Prime Minister then was, it was very difficult to make him feel happy with any entertainment program. Sri Deve Gowda is a 100% politician. Nothing other than politics will interest him. So we tried our best to make him sit in a place and see a dance, which we could not. But in any case, we were successful in preparing the plan. Finally, we did give a package to the satisfaction of the Prime Minister. But the point I want to mention is his identification of areas which have not been looked after by the others and preparing a comprehensive plan for each one of them instead of putting all of them together. That worked very well, both in this case and also in J&K. Thank you.
So my question to you as someone who has been in politics for so long, has seen Mr. Deve Gowda from a long time. If I were to ask you 2 or 3 things that explain his long, consistent political innings, right? What are those 2 or 3 qualities that you will choose to highlight?
One thing is that he will never give up. He was denied ticket twice by the National Party. He never gave up. He fought and he became successful. Again, in 1978, when it was almost decided that he would be the chief minister, our party lost. Then again, he never gave it up, and again he fought and patiently waited for it and waited for the opportunity. And 83, he was able to bring back the party to the government. So that is persistence and consistency in his efforts and struggle. He will never feel tired in fighting. He always enjoys. As Chiranjiv Singh was telling that he always prefers to struggle than enjoy the power. That is his main destiny, I believe, but he was very persistent in that. And his commitment for irrigating Karnataka, both northern and southern Karnataka, he never gave it up. In fact, when he was a very powerful minister in Ramakrishna Heggde's ministry, holding water resources and PWD portfolio, just for the sake of that the allotment for Kaveri was less, he gave up his ministry. He gave up his ministry and he fought Ramakrishna Heggde, and then ultimately it resulted in splitting of the party, and so many things happened, but he didn't care, but he saw to it that issue of Kaveri will never die and it is always relevant. And many of his decisions, now most of the people will attach Deve Gowda for rural economy and all these things. This IT park in Bangalore, the credit should go to him. The international airport in Bangalore, the credit should go to him. So many of the achievements which Karnataka has done, and it achieved many things there. Unfortunately, the credit is not given to the person, because he is not the person who will always wants to take that credit, but he feels that it is his duty. Another thing which is nowadays politicians should learn from him is, I have seen many chief ministers and many ministers and prime ministers worked with them, but he was the one person who gets up at 4:30 in the morning, reads the file, and prepares the note himself. Some of them were shown. That was one hotel somewhere, some hotel he was staying in Singapore. In that Singapore hotel letterhead itself, or that writing pad, he has prepared a note and given it to a secretary. That much of commitment he has got. And when there are opportunity for many people to see the files in archives, or they are available now. He is the only minister and chief minister whom I have seen to make a long note in all the files. It is his personal opinion and it is in his own handwriting. That is the commitment he has. And he gives very less time for his person, and he gives most of the time for his public life.
You were talking about, my question to Sugata now, you were talking about a few things that were unrecognized, right? You were talking about the international airport, the IT park. Similarly, there are a couple of other things which are covered in the book. Right. His expertise in irrigation matters, right, and his expertise in river water sharing. Right? Could you talk a little bit about that? Tell us a little bit.
He's a world-class authority on that, and it's not my certification that he needs. In fact, I've been looking at World Bank documents very closely on how he rehabilitated people in the Krishna basin. Even to this day, the World Bank thinks that that was one of the finest packages that was ever given. And ever since, whenever they went to Southeast Asia, South Asian countries, and when they explained this package, the people there started saying, it was again like the paddy variety, people started saying, we want the Gowda package. So that was the kind of, and this was crafted by him. See, it is not that it was done by somebody and he just said okay and signed on the file. As Mr. Shankar said, you see his notings, detailed notings, quarrels with bureaucrats, asking questions. I have been a journalist for 25 years. I have traveled with many prime ministers. I have seen many chief ministers. But this is something which is unusual. And if you look at the Farakka Treaty, that's something that I looked at very closely. And I, as a biographer, I did not want to speak to anybody on this side of the divide. I spoke to people on the other side. That's the people in Bangladesh. So they were unhappy about only one thing. They said Mr. Deve Gowda did injustice by signing the treaty only for 30 years. It should have been a perennial treaty because it's so good that they said the Cusack's calculations that was done has not created a single problem to this day in the last 25 years. That is the accuracy with which he did it. And there is a story behind how he did it. See, Mr. Basu, Jyoti Basu was very, very afraid to go ahead with it because that was, something that would affect West Bengal. He was the chief minister. People in Bihar who were supporting his government did not want it because the huge flood relief money that would go every year because of the floods would be sort of cancelled out if this happened. So there were lots of vested interests. And then there was the bureaucracy. The water department people did not want it to be signed because they always put up a counter note. Then there was the Foreign Affairs Ministry, which I read the notes, and they are experts at creating hurdles. So nobody was trying to resolve the problem. So one day Mr. Deve Gowda calls Mr. Basu. It's just a meeting of 2 or 3 hours. And he says, you don't worry, I will handle Sheikh Hasina, I will do this, you will have no problem, we'll go ahead with this. And the result of that is so fascinating. And it's, as Mr. Shankar said, we are really people who are, we don't seem to credit him enough. If you go to Bangladesh today, the poor people of Bangladesh in the lower riparian districts will take soil in their hand and they say, we eat today, we drink today because Mr. Deve Gowda gave us water. This is Bangladesh. I'm not speaking about this side of, this is people of Bangladesh who remember what he did for them. Similarly, in the Northeast, he is remembered when Mr. Modi went there to inaugurate the Bogibeel Bridge. People held placards and they said, where is Mr. Deve Gowda? He planned it for us. Get him also. People who have benefited from him, the fact is that they remember him in other parts of India. You go to Gujarat, and I've quoted Medha Patkar. She's the most difficult person. She tells me that we did not realize the graciousness with which Mr. Deve Gowda invited us for a discussion on the height of the Narmada Dam or the cancellation of the project. She said, today, you cannot have a debate with this Prime Minister. Just see, he invited us to his house, we protested in his house, we abused him in his house, and we walked out from his house, and he said it's part of democracy. You have your right to protest. See, that was the kind of Prime Minister. It was not that things were on the table for him and it was easy and he signed and everything happened. It was his democratic engagement which comes out even in his irrigation stuff. Kaveri, of course, they've all spoken. I don't want to speak about Kaveri. Mr. Nariman spoke so eloquently about his engagement. He went and fought with Mr. Nariman also, saying that you cannot do this, you cannot argue this. And Mr. Nariman was the top lawyer, and Brajesh is here. Brajesh was part of that team. So Mr. Deve Gowda would go and argue with Mr. Nariman also, because his insights were uncommon, and Mr. Nariman has spoken so eloquently about that. And I don't know where he got that kind of insight. It is he believes in divinity, so it must have come from somewhere, because he did not study them formally. The only thing that he did as a student, which I mentioned in the book, was he went to the Bakranangal dam as a student, as some kind of an education trip. And he was, even at that age, as a young man, he wonders, where are the canals that connect this water thing? This Nehru has built this big dam, but where are the connections? How are people going to get water? We are storing water, we have built a big dam, fine, but where are the canals? So that is the kind of mind that he had. And all of this culminated, Karthik, one last thing, is in something that he developed as a Prime Minister, and it was called the Exhilarated Irrigation Project. Even to this day, if every state of India has benefited, Karnataka has benefited least, and If Karnataka has benefited, it is not the area that votes for Mr. Deve Gowda or for Mr. Kumaraswamy. Kaveri Basin has not benefited from the Exhilarated Irrigation project. 10,000 crores went to Krishna Basin. And the people of North Karnataka should realize and at least now tell that Mr. Deve Gowda should not be measured by his caste politics or some kind of pettiness with which he is treated. He has given them water. And in the book, I quote from World Bank documents. I speak to Mr. Jamdar, who does not belong to his community, an upright officer whom Mr. Meenakshisundaram helped post into that job because he was a very difficult man to handle. So they gave him the most difficult task. And he speaks about how Mr. Deve Gowda would overnight clear things and tell him, don't worry, you go. That was his style. He would retrospectively get things cleared in the cabinet and in the assembly, or even when he was prime minister in parliament. He would just go and announce something on fertilizers. And if the finance secretary, Mr. Montek speaks about it in the book, if the finance secretary came and told him, sir, you have done this, we are still not, your budget is far away, he would say, I know how to do it, just go back and rework this, and this you adjust here. And he would be stunned. He was a man of numbers and policy and all that, and Deve Gowda had this kind of intuitive idea of things, which I don't know where he got from. As a biographer, if I failed on one thing, I do not know how he acquired this knowledge. Even Mr. Nariman asked me the other day, Sugata, how do you think this man understood all these things? I said, sir, you have known him for longer. You should ask him.
We have time for one last question, right? One of the things that Mr. Chiranjiv Singh was saying was that the book humanizes Dr. Gowda. So my question is to both of you, right? Working with Mr. Gowda, right? Sir, Dr. Sundaram, you have worked with him. What was a typical day like when he was Prime Minister or when he was Chief Minister?
It was not difficult at all to work with him because he used to work quite a lot. He will start at about 4:30 or 5 and he will go on till midnight, and all through the time he will only do things relating to either his chief ministership or the prime ministership. He was very considerate to all of us. Actually, I don't get up early in the morning, and he used to tell his PA, don't wake him up before 7 o'clock. If I want to talk to him, you give me the connection after 7. So at 7 o'clock, if I get a call, I know the chief minister or the prime minister wants to talk to me. So he was very considerate, but he will work himself. There is no problem at all. Throughout the day he will work. Though sometimes he will close his eyes, I have never believed that he is going to sleep. He will get up at the correct time and put the right questions. That means his mind is working. He has been, as I said earlier, the only thing which I noticed was you cannot engage him on anything other than his work. So that probably explains how he has been successful in dealing with everything to the minute detail. That's it.
Karthik, Sugata has written, when I select a person, I apply my mind, I believe in God. And that is what I was telling you, that one takeaway from the book, apart from all the achievements and politics, etc., is some of the philosophical questions which have been raised. I believe in God. I know Chandran, that is Satish Chandran Saab. I know Chandran follows his dharma. He will never betray me. Now the interesting thing is, Mr. Satish Chandran was an atheist. And he was a person who...
As a biographer, I'm also an atheist. The biography of the most devout person.
And I mean, I never worked directly under Gowda Saab, but as I mentioned in the beginning, when he was leader of opposition, I was DS to the CM. And he would raise some points in the assembly, and I had to run and get those figures immediately for the CM to reply. And it was such a difficult thing because in irrigation, at that time it was part of PWD only. The PWD will have one set of figures, the command area people would have another set of figures, the revenue department and agriculture department have different sets of figures. So I had very difficult time in getting information for the CM to reply to Mr. Gowda. So then I said to Mr. Lin, there were only two of us in the CM secretariat at that time. There was one under secretary who didn't deal with files and these works. And I said, sir, we must have the computerization of this information. So by then the computer center was beginning to be set up. And I think my daily telling them, please computerize all this data, computerize all this information so that we have at least one set of figures which is immediately available. That was due to Mr. Gowda. But I mean, I think the training that he got as leader of opposition stood him throughout his career, and he was able to do so well in his parliamentary career because of that training. But as Sundaram has said, he was extremely courteous to people. And outside politics, I remember one day he had a particularly, he gave Deve Gowda Mr. Ars a particularly difficult time. He was at his ferocious best. In the evening, I went to the palace. There was a cottage in Bangalore Palace where often Mr. Ars went to clear the files. I took the files for clearance to him. And what do I see? And I was new then to the CM's office. And I was very young in service, just 2 years of regular service and 2 years of training. I saw Mr. Ars putting his arm on his shoulders and both of them having a merry walk. So, I mean, that is the kind of person with which to deal with in official capacity is not difficult, provided you have his confidence and trust. It's all a matter of trust. But then, as Sugata has written, he never spent a penny on public relations or image management.
Right. Far cry from today. Right, there's far more that we would like to discuss, but given the paucity of time, I think we should stop here. Right? One question. Sure.
Mr. Sugata, I don't know whether you have found an answer to one most enigmatic and intriguing question that begs an answer. On that fateful day in 1997 April, when Mr. Gowdaji was returning from USSR, Congress party suddenly withdrew support. They brought down only Mr. Deve Gowda from the Prime Ministership, but not the United Front government. Within the next 3-4 days, the entire cabinet of Mr. Deve Gowda was intact with I.K. Gujral as the Prime Minister. And Congress party owes an explanation to this country and to the people of Karnataka. Why did they bring down Deve Gowda alone? There was neither rational reason nor a justification.
Thank you, sir. I've actually discussed it in the book. And you cannot, when you're writing a biography and when something has happened behind the scenes, you cannot write it with absolute certainty, but I have given enough indications, enough and more indications as to why it happened. There are several things that were happening at that time. There were several strains, and Mr. Kesri's connections with a media house or a lot of things, the Pranab Mukherjee factor, which Mr. Nitish Kumar in his parliamentary speech speaks about. He speaks about a Bengali-Bihari combination which was trying to bring Mr. Deve Gowda down. And Mr. Pranab Mukherjee in his autobiography, he unabashedly says how he drafted the letter for Mr. Kesri to bring him down. And to be fair to Mr. Kesri, after he had gone and met the president, he realized that they had all sort of duped him. And he sent an emissary to Mr. Deve Gowda, and that was Mr. Dhawan. And Mr. Dhawan said, sir, we will continue with this. Mr. Kesri has understood the problem. Can you just apologize in public? And Mr. Deve Gowda being Mr. Deve Gowda, he said, no question of apology. I can only say from hereafter we will consult the Congress. That's all. Otherwise, no question. And you should also remember, sir, you have been a stalwart reporter yourself and journalist yourself, that Mr. Vajpayee tries to help Mr. Deve Gowda's government. He is trying to work through not just one or two people. He is putting Mr. Balasaheb Thackeray on the job to contact him and say, don't be a fool, just accept our support. Then there is Sahib Singh Verma coming and speaking to him. Then there is Ram Jethmalani who is just barging into his office and he's saying, what are you doing? And finally, Vajpayee does not give up. Chidambaram speaks to me about this. He says, there is a dinner that previous night and Mr. Deve Gowda has confided to Mr. Chidambaram that, Mr. Chidambaram, there is no question of going with the BJP. He has just made it very clear. And Chidambaram says that he was very firm. Next day morning, when the vote of confidence is about to begin, Shrikant Jana, his parliamentary minister, gets a small chit, and the chit is being carried by Jashwant Singh. And that chit says, Mr. Deve Gowda, we will support you. It is still not late. Mr. Deve Gowda, Shrikant Jana had preserved that chit for some time. Apparently he has lost it. But Mr. Deve Gowda remembers the content. He remembers the content. Chidambaram remembers the content. So they did not, he just did not even make eye contact with Vajpayee at that point. He said, no question, I will go back. And the same story that Mr. Shankar was telling you. I will go back, I will fight, I will rise like a phoenix from the ashes to rule this country again. That was the attitude. And think about history, if at that point his government had lost and United Front government had lost power, and Mr. Deve Gowda had gone to elections, which was what his original plan was, and he's backstabbed by his own United Front partners. And I have written about what happens on the last day at the breakfast table in the Prime Minister's house. If he had gone to elections, I am too junior, but my reading is he would have come back to power because he was extremely popular in Northeast. I'm just making a rough calculation of the seats. Uttar Pradesh, the western part of Uttar Pradesh, the number of seats, West Bengal, Northeast, Gujarat. Gujarat, he had installed a government. Please remember, Shankar Singh Waghela was his man. In October, where he goes to rename the Sardar Patel, the airport is renamed as Sardar Patel Airport, and he gets a delegation in the evening, probably led by Mr. Modi, who gives a memorandum and says, please don't call it Sardar Patel Airport, please call it Shama Prasad Mukherjee Airport. So today, anyway, Mr. Modi has owned up the legacy of Patel, but that is what he did. And if you just calculate the number of seats, as we do as psephologists each time there's an election, Mr. Deve Gowda would have easily got, in my estimation, I did that calculation but did not write in the book because it would be too speculative and people will just harp on it. My calculation was he would get 160 seats. And 160 was enough with the coalition partners. He would be back in the seat and saddle, and probably he would have ruled this country for a longer period. But that is the what if of history.
Ravindra, Sugata has written in the book, he never traded self-esteem for power.
I think that is a line which should go down in history. He never traded his self-esteem for power. That is something that not just I reading into it, people who have deserted him today, people who fought elections against him, people who defeated him, people who have, done everything possible against him, tell me one thing, but sir, this is the underlying thing. He would never compromise his self-esteem for power. He'll just throw his resignation and go. He behaved like editors like us. We would always carry a resignation letter in our pocket. And he was like that as a minister. In fact, when I remember this thing about Manmohan Singh, I'll end with this. Manmohan Singh is caught in the, he's not caught. His government, Mr. Narasimha Rao's government is caught in the security scam. And he has resigned. At least token resignation is submitted. And he has still come to attend the house. And Mr. Deve Gowda gets up and he says, I have been a minister too. When I resigned, I never went to the house and spoke like a minister. Why have you come here? He's asking Mr. Manmohan Singh, it's part of the parliamentary record. I am not saying anything new, it's part of the parliamentary record. And the kind of tough time he gave Manmohan Singh between 1991 and 1994, I just quote from the parliamentary debates. And that is so enriching. And I had a chat with Dr. Singh Saab, and he acknowledges that that was exemplary parliamentary debate on the part of Mr. Deve Gowda, which is never spoken about in Karnataka. That's the sad part.
That's a good note to end on. Did not trade self-esteem for power. Maybe you could take this offline. I think we have some pressure to end.
There's a pressure to end.
There's pressure to end.
I have not taken my wife to Kashmir about the romance and things like Chiranjiv Singh. I would like to talk about Sugata. He has actually played romance with the words, romance with the phrases, romance with the idiom. For a writer, in search of an idiom, he found out a person, a persona, a personality. I have read so many biographies by M.J.R. by Radhip Sarjasai on Modi, etc. But Sugata's biography is one of the excellent literary pieces I have read.
Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you everyone for your valuable insights. We are glad that all of you could make in time from your busy schedule and come to the event. A small token of appreciation from us to Mr. Karthik. On behalf of Prabha Khaitan Foundation, I would like to thank Mr. Deve Gowda, Mr. M.N. Venkatachaliah, our eminent panelist, Mr. Chiranjiv Singh, Mr. Meenakshisundaram, Mr. B.L. Shankar, author Mr. Sugata Srinivasaraju, and Mr. Venkatesh for engaging in such wonderful conversation. I would also like to show my gratitude towards our presenter, Shri Cement Limited and Associates Penguin Random House and Taj West in Bengaluru. Last but not the least, I thank the audience for being present here, for being part of this endeavor. Without your support, this evening would not have been successful. With this note, we conclude today's program. Thank you and good night.
पधारो हमारे देश যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে তবে একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো একলা চলো রে যদি তোর ডাক শুনে কেউ না আসে তবে একলা চলো রে
बरसने लागी बदरिया रूम झूम के बरसने लागी बदरिया रूम झूम के रूम झूम रूम झूम रूम झूम के बरसने लागी बदरिया रूम झूम के बरसने लागी
तोरे नैना की लागी